Today we have the opportunity to have a discussion with Dr. Luke Gardner. Dr. Gardner is an advisor with the California Sea Grant Program and a specialist in aquaculture. His research focuses on developing sustainable methods of aquaculture that benefit both industry and conservation. Let's hear what he has to say.
So aquaculture has really broad definitions. It's basically the cultivation of anything that is truly aquatic, and the FAO consider the definition as something that is both cultivated, that you need to actually have some sort of hand in the husbandry of it, but also some sort of ownership at some point. So those are the kind of really broad definitions of aquaculture. So when you consider things that maybe aren't aquaculture, something like hydroponics, it sounds like it's aquaculture, it's plants growing in water, but the plants are actually terrestrial plants, so it doesn't make it aquaculture. If those plants are aquatic, it is aquaculture. So it's a very broad definition of basically some form of husbandry or caring for an organism, and some form of ownership, whether it be for the entire life cycle or a brief period of the life cycle before you then move it into the wild, if you're talking about some sort of like restocking or restoration effort. Now, why aquaculture is important? So aquaculture, again, along with the definition, is very broad, but the thing that makes aquaculture probably the most important is that it produces food. When it comes to seafood, we've relied on the ocean and fisheries generating our seafood in the past for thousands of years now. The problem is now we see like the majority of our fisheries are kind of fish to capacity or overcapacity. However, there's more and more people in the world, and these people want to eat seafood. And not only are there more people, but increasingly the amount of seafood that each individual person is eating is going up. And so just like thousands of years ago, we stopped relying on hunting and foraging in the forests for food. We're starting to do that now with aquaculture, and so we're starting to farm, because while fisheries still produce a lot of seafood, aquaculture now produces more than 50% of the world's seafood. So aquaculture can be broken up into a couple of different ways and methods that it's done. There's basically freshwater aquaculture, but there's also marine aquaculture. Marine aquaculture is sometimes called mariculture. But in addition to that, what you can have is land-based aquaculture, and so this is where you've typically got things in tanks and water coming in and water going out. You can also have recirculating aquaculture. Again, something that's usually on land in a tank, but the water this time goes around and around and around, and you have a bunch of filters. The other form of aquaculture we've got is open water aquaculture, and so this is the kind of thing that you might think of fish pens or oysters or seaweed, and that's kind of out in the environment with the ocean surrounding it, providing it the majority of its needs. The other kind of definitions of aquaculture is whether it's kind of intensive, semi-intensive, or extensive. And so intensive aquaculture is where you're providing the organism with absolutely everything. And extensive aquaculture is where you're providing the organism with a minimal amount of input. So oysters might be an extensive form of aquaculture. A finfish in a recirculating aquaculture system is intensive. So marine aquaculture, unlike freshwater aquaculture, kind of got a little bit of a later start. Some people might not know, but freshwater aquaculture has been around for a long time, like thousands of years, with the birthplace in China. But marine aquaculture is much more recent. Some people say the kind of renaissance period of marine aquaculture was back in the kind of the 60s and 70s. And so one of our biggest kind of concerns with marine aquaculture is how to grow these things. We haven't had the benefit of hundreds or thousands of years to understand the husbandry. And so whenever you try and grow something in captivity, you basically need to know everything about it. So that's one of our biggest hang-ups. The other stuff that makes marine aquaculture a little bit more difficult is that you're in a marine environment, and a lot of your infrastructure and your equipment won't tolerate kind of salt environments. Things don't last nearly as long, and your access to it. Particularly in open water aquaculture, it's much more weather dependent. So getting out there is difficult. All these things are not typically seen in freshwater aquaculture. So when it comes to aquaculture and kind of environmental impacts, there's a whole raft of different ones, but generally speaking, there's fed aquaculture and unfed aquaculture. And so examples of fed aquaculture are things like fish and shrimp. So the farmer needs to provide them with some sort of food. And then unfed aquaculture, we're talking about things like filter feeders or seaweeds. And both of those, in the case of filter feeders, they're just literally filtering out the microalgae that might be floating by them. Or seaweed, they're using those dissolved nutrients that are already in the water. Why that has more or less environmental impacts is just simply based on the inputs. But usually with fed aquaculture, some of the concerns are eutrophication potential and feces dropping out of these systems and creating anoxic places if it's concentrated. And so fed aquaculture really tries to concentrate on how to minimize those effects. So they don't want to feed too much, and they want to make sure that wherever they are feeding, that it's got maybe the correct current to kind of distribute the feces out after the animal dispels it. So the other thing about fed aquaculture that can have more of an environmental impact is where you're sourcing that food from. So generally speaking, when you're growing something, it's always more efficient to not grow something to then feed it to something else. But there's a lot of different market demands as to what people want and why different forms of fed aquaculture happens. But one of the typical kind of environmental concerns around fed aquaculture, particularly finfish, is in the absence of knowing exactly what a fish needs to eat, people feed it another fish. And so that's what we're talking about, like fish meal and fish oil. Fish meal and fish oil typically come from forage fisheries, and so we're thinking like Peruvian anchovies and sardines, all these small fish. The issue with that is there's simply not enough of those fish out there to supply enough of the feed for the predicted increase of aquaculture. And so, that's definitely a concern. We don't want to overfish a wild fishery to feed to an aquaculture species. And so there's a lot of research right now on basically seeing what the alternatives are that we can feed. And this comes from both an economic standpoint and an environmental standpoint, because as fish meal and fish oil becomes more scarce, the price goes up, and so the farmers also can't afford it anymore. So my role as an extension specialist means that I do research of all varieties, from policy research all the way down to bucket science research. But generally, with a lot of my research, it's a lot of basic biology, understanding how we can grow things for aquaculture, but also understanding how we're doing things in can do them in a sustainable way. So a lot of the research is emerging species, particularly when it comes to marine aquaculture. So people are thinking about what kind of different things we can farm. And in order to farm something, we need to know how to close the life cycle. And closing the life cycle means that we need to understand how to spawn that animal in captivity, how to raise the larvae, how to raise the juveniles, how to raise the adults all the way up to a harvest size, and then be able to take those animals and spawn again from captivity. So a lot of the research is simply understanding what things can eat, how things can, what kind of water quality parameters things can tolerate, and what, and not. So aquaculture kind of got its start a little bit later than agriculture, and so there's a lot of people that are concerned that aquaculture development could see similar kind of impacts that the industrialization of agriculture has seen, and so consequently aquaculture struggles to develop based on some of these perceptions. But I think just like any kind of new industry, aquaculture has now come a long way from where it was, 30 or 40 years ago. And so things are a lot more environmentally sustainable. And so as we continue to move with that, as well as the scientific community starting to study it more, people are starting to see that there are intrinsic benefits to aquaculture. And so I think when people start to see some of these kind of pilot scale experiments and get to understand what aquaculture is, maybe some of those perceptions will change. Yeah, so a lot of people don't know that aquaculture has some intrinsic benefits to the environment. And so if you consider something like oyster farmers are right there along a lot of the environmental advocates. In order to farm an oyster, you need really clean water, kind of free of pathogens and pollution. And so the very act of doing some of these forms of aquaculture can improve the environment. Things like, again, filter feeders. Those filter feeders are filtering all the excess sediments and nutrients out of the water. And that's helping things like eelgrass now grow, or reducing the potential for harmful algal blooms happening. Similar with seaweed aquaculture. Seaweed aquaculture can suck up all those kind of dissolved nutrients that would ordinarily go out and cause eutrophication problems. So there are definitely forms of aquaculture that have intrinsic benefits while also a commercial benefit. And I think that's rare nowadays, but I think if we can kind of leverage things that people can like make a living off and also help the environment, I think that's a really important thing. The other thing I'd like to say about aquaculture that people might not realize is that aquaculture can help with restoration of both habitats as well as species. So once upon a time, people were much more concerned with how to make aquaculture more sustainable. Now aquaculture is helping environmental organizations with their own missions of maybe restoring a species. So sometimes through human intervention, a species population has gotten really low and it can't breed in the wild anymore. Now these organizations want to kind of put more of those organisms back out there, whether it be restocking or whatnot. But they don't necessarily have the infrastructure or the expertise to do it. Aquaculture has a long history understanding how to grow very similar species in captivity, and they have infrastructure, large footprints that allow growing a lot of organisms at scales that a lot of these smaller organizations couldn't achieve. And so partnerships with aquaculture are now helping restoration.